That's really unfortunate. Absolutely. Let us go ahead and get started. So the undergraduates, you will topic for the first paper. I'm sorry, it's the second paper, I mean. So the first one you've now received one of the second paper. On the day this one is due, which is March 27, we will also be handing out our final prompt. This will be the prompt, of course, that everyone in the class, for all students. So any question about the papers, either the two for the undergraduates or for the final paper? Yes, please.
On the syllabus, it said that the second paper was going to be due April 10th.
No, forget about it. Dates on the syllabus.
Okay, all right. This is the new date. Okay, thank you.
Later rules override earlier. That's what we believe in law.
Any other questions? Okay, well, let us go ahead and get started. So our goal today will be to begin with a conclusion of our discussion last week, which was on Christian hope. We will then turn probably roughly halfway through our session by turning to our next topic, which is the entire theme of desire and its implications for our understanding of this larger project. So let me begin by laying out very briefly the outline of where we've been these past 3 weeks and where we'll be going the next 2 weeks, and then situate that within our larger discussion. So as you know, this entire set of weeks has been concerned with the theme of self-construction, and what we've been looking at are a series of attempts within this project to work out its larger implications, both in terms of the strengths and weaknesses. In terms of the strengths, what we can learn. In terms of the weaknesses, needless to say, where it is that this project has run aground and how it can be rescued. We began by discussing the extreme focus on the self and the self's attempt to attain greatness through radical nonconformity, reading Emerson and Nietzsche. And as we noted, both the incredible excitement of that vision, of utilizing the self as the basis by which all customs and conventions are questioned, and all values are then reevaluated based upon the self. We also noted the potential dangers, playing out particularly strongly with a figure like Nietzsche, in which almost by definition, if you go too far down this path, what it leads to is this extreme level of hierarchy where those few, the Übermensch in Nietzsche's terms, become the radical figures who can so achieve this, and everyone else, of course, is left aside. And although Nietzsche himself doesn't work out the political implications, as many of you noted, are nonetheless potentially extremely chilling, and we know historically, albeit through dramatic misreadings, many of those played out in horrifying ways. We also noted, of course, along with that potential danger, the other danger of this radical focus on the self. The self is the basis for everything, and we noted in passing, and later, really after spring break, we'll be turning in more detail to a discussion of those philosophies that will say that's already an extreme level of danger to even be focusing on that. But we'll come back to that. After that, we turn to the entire theme of romanticism. Romanticism not only in the key moment in the 19th century when you have the Romantic movement, but really the larger focus on the Romantic project. Here too, noticing its great powers. Here too, noticing its potential dangers. Here, with a focus on all context situations as being, by definition, limiting to the radically heroic individual, what you create is the romantic narrative of the great, and almost always by definition tragic hero, standing against the context of his time, standing against the world of his time, and for that great heroic but always brief moment, he fully breaks the bounds that limit him, and of course, at the end, he is tragically either retrapped by that context, or even if it ends heroically, the narrative always by definition must end right at the moment when, sort of daily domestic drudgery would begin thereafter. Meaning, in other words, that this side of the project, when taken to its extreme, takes out the possibility of what would seem to be a key set of questions, namely, how would one live one's life outside of this radical act of momentary rebellion, and what type of a world could we potentially build that would be more than simply this radical world of conformity that we're endlessly having to break against. We then turned to the theme of Christian hope, which we'll be discussing a bit more today for roughly the first hour, where we were discussing the entire theme of love and hope as it emerged, and we'll say a few more words about that, so I will leave that here. And thereafter, beginning roughly halfway through this session, we will turn to yet another sort of piece of this larger project, which is a focus on the self, the desires of the self, and the fulfillment of these desires, and the degree to which society either prevents our fulfillment or could potentially be reorganized such that it could fulfill our desires. And we will discuss the possible strengths, but also dangers of this way of thinking. And then that following week, which will be, of course, the week right before spring break, we will then take the opportunity, building upon by then 4 weeks of discussions of this project, and ask, are there ways we could rescue this project, given the potential dangers and actual dangers that we will have seen over the previous 4 weeks? Given these dangers that have played out philosophically and we now know historically, do we abandon the project? Or if not, how would we rethink it in a way that would rescue it? Now, with that as a general theme, let me now turn more specifically to the theme of hope and love that we touched on in the last half of last class, and say a few more words about this, because this, of course, is a view that, as we have already seen several key figures think might be a basis on which to sort of rethink and, in a sense, even rescue this project of self-construction. So let me say now a few more words about it. First of all, as a general introduction, let me take you back very quickly to remind you of our discussion of Nietzsche, who, as you will remember, saw the entire emergence of Christianity as one of the key, but above all, worst moments in the destruction of the radical sense of greatness that existed in the aristocratic societies of the ancient world. So, as you'll recall, Nietzsche's construction was, at least for all of its other problems, at least the great heroic cultures of ancient Greece consisted of these aristocrats who sought their own radical fame and greatness, and their destruction and the destruction of that whole world where they could achieve such greatness came about as a revolt of the slaves who invented what Nietzsche called a slave morality based upon things like Christian love, which would claim that we should love everyone universally, which of course for Nietzsche means we therefore hold back the greatness of the radical individual. And then for Nietzsche, the working out of the remainder of Western history consists of the working out of this slave morality as it takes root, then ultimately in the 19th century becomes secularized into various forms of liberal political ideology, but all for Nietzsche amounting to the same thing. And the result is a world that he saw as radically nihilistic, all larger values completely destroyed, and people simply living in this dead world of now secularized Christian love, requiring the radical Übermensch to emerge and, at least for themselves, rethink all values based upon their own seeking of greatness. Now, we noted the dangers of this view, but I remind you of that argument to make a contrast. We, beginning yesterday, also began exploring another figure, and we discussed him as well in our discussion of Romanticism, Hegel, who will reconstruct this project in a very different way. Obviously, earlier, Hegel precedes Nietzsche by quite a bit, but for our purposes, philosophically, it's worth noting the radically different way that Hegel will try to interpret the development of Western civilization, and most particularly for our concerns here, the development of Christian visions of love and hope, a vision that, as we will see, contrasts rather dramatically with Nietzsche's, with implications that I think raise some very important questions for us philosophically. So let me take a brief moment to quickly explain Hegel's view. And since several of you have mentioned to me in office hours that we're reading only a few excerpts from Hegel and you don't have a good sense of how all of this fits together, which is very understandable, let me also take a few moments in this discussion to lay out Hegel's larger project, allow you to see what it is he's doing, and our concern, as usual, will be less what Hegel's ultimate purpose is, but rather what we can learn from the way that he is trying to do this. So let me say a few words about Hegel, what he is trying to do, and then how his radically different vision of Christian love and hope plays into his understanding. So very quickly, Hegel's argument is the following. Hegel views himself as living at a key moment in world history, and he views himself as a key figure in this key moment in world history. So, according to him, the early 19th century represents a final fulfillment of the working out of world philosophy, allowing for a possible moment, which he thinks he is now in the act of achieving, of putting together a final synthesis that would encompass all knowledge that has ever existed and properly place all knowledge within its proper place, and therefore allow a true world of radical freedom in a way that has thus far eluded all humans. And he saw his project as, in fact, doing this. In fact, his first major work, the work that comes after the early theological writings I'll be getting to momentarily, but his sort of first grand synthesis where he attempts this, is a work called The Phenomenology of Spirit, which is written from the perspective of absolute spirit. Hegel writes this, from the perspective of absolute spirit, and it is what he calls a phenomenology, which is for him a reconstruction of the entire development of world philosophy leading up to this final synthesis. And he then continues writing several other works in which all of it's coming from a different perspective, but in this case it's a phenomenology. He will also do a history. He will do, as we have seen, a philosophy of art. It's always, however, the same move. It's seeing how for any given area of knowledge, a process unfolded leading up to his final synthesis. Now, that process involves for him a key set of factors, the single most important of which will be tensions that lead to a dialectic. And what he means by this is the following. Since, until his final synthesis, every single philosophical position, and therefore every social practice based upon these philosophical positions, has been limited, it also means that every single philosophical position will either involve its own set of contradictions, which will lead ultimately to its own rethinking, or will have to deal with a counterposition that will create a fundamental tension with it, because again, it by definition is limited. And then human history for Hegel consists in its most important moments, until the final synthesis, of these radical tensions playing out. When I say at its most productive moments, the danger from a Hegelian perspective is when the dialectic is, for whatever reason, stopped. And Hegel thinks for vast stretches of time in human history, the tensions have not been allowed to play out, either because you will get a civilization that will get so taken with one single, and therefore, by definition, limited philosophical perspective, but it will become so accepted that everyone will simply accept it for centuries or millennia, and that will lead to radical stasis. or you will get a period when there seems to be a perfect synthesis that, again, will lead to stasis until finally you get something that will break it out. Now, the reason I mention all of this is because Hegel is absolutely committed to the view that only in the West, because of the emergence of Christianity, do you get the key dialectic emerging that for him will ultimately lead to the final synthesis. Hegel will also argue that all non-Western civilizations fail to create this dialectic because they all get stuck in some kind of single position that stops them. We will note after spring break, when we start looking at a lot of these other different religious movements, that this is a very dangerous reading, to put it mildly, but it becomes a very typical reading that will continue after Hegel, that basically think of non-Western civilizations as lacking tension, creating worlds of stasis that have continued until they are broken apart in the 19th century by European powers. This is a very dangerous view. It's also empirically wrong. However, I mention it because for Hegel, this is key. The reason his work will focus on the Western tradition is he will claim it's the only one that creates this fundamental tension that will lead to the synthesis. Now, later, after spring break, we will look at how and why Hegel and those following the Hegelian paradigm, which we'll see includes most people who buy into a general modernity paradigm, why they have so misread non-Christian traditions. But let me here just lay out, it is a key part of what Hegel is going to be trying to argue. Now, with that being said, let's now turn to why, for Hegel, Christianity will play such a key role. A piece of this we've already seen in his discussion of Romanticism, which as we discussed, when he's discussing classicism and Romanticism, he means not the classical arts of, say, the 18th century and Romanticism of the 19th century. As we noted, what he's really talking about is the classical world of antiquity, and Romanticism for him begins with the introduction of Christianity. And as we noted when we discussed that work, the work on the philosophy of art, the argument going very quickly was the great, extraordinary, harmonious beauty of classical antique art, but he would also expand this, equally true in the philosophical realm as well, as we will see, is that it achieved a perfect harmony between form and content, such that you will get, and one of his prize examples are these beautiful Greek statues, a perfect framing in which the content and form perfectly match, and hence this incredible feeling of harmony and synthesis that you see in Greece. This is equally true, although we haven't read it, in terms of his arguments of classical philosophy as well. Same thing. The argument will be, in a nutshell, the world is seen as fundamentally structured and harmonious. We, humans, find our proper place within it. There's slight variations, whether you define this in a Platonic way or an Aristotelian way. So in the former, it's a question of matching yourself to this larger structure. In the latter, with Aristotle, it's a question of becoming moderate to work within this larger structure. But regardless, the goal is fit yourself perfectly within the pre-given structure. Now, as you can already imagine, for reasons I've mentioned, for Hegel, this is why it will seem wonderful and powerful and moving. It is also for Hegel why it is incredibly dangerous, because that sense of perfect harmony also creates stasis. And so for Hegel, this is very dangerous. Also, in today's, or beginning last week's, but ongoingly readings, in his early theological writings, which is before he works out his philosophical synthesis, he will also make basically the same argument about pre-Christian traditions. So his reading of Judaism, as you have seen, is that Judaism is a religion of the law. Insofar as a religion of the law, it would risk, although he thinks this doesn't really happen fully, it would risk the same kind of stasis we're talking about. But luckily, in his opinion, because we want to move out of this, He thinks the big difference there is if you have a religious tradition based upon following the law, it will inherently create a break. And so if you have a tradition, including what he would call positive law, which is to say there are a series of laws and humans must simply follow them, in his opinion, this will inherently create an unhappy or angry conscience, to use one of the terms he will use later when he develops the full synthesis, but you see the hints of it in his early theological writings, because by definition, a series of laws can never accurately govern everything we should do. Even if we could perfectly follow that law, it would not lead to a better world in any kind of complex way. We will always, therefore, feel it to be inadequate at some level. And of course, he also thinks we will never really be able to fully follow the law, which means it will always create this sense of our failures. And either of those can play out to thinking the laws themselves to be inadequate. And since these are seen as divinely given, it can even lead to a sense that we are being controlled by a blind fate that actually is not, therefore, part of a perfectly structured, harmonious system that we should simply be following, but in fact will, again, create, and all the more so, anger and resentment against these laws that we're being asked to follow. So, for Hegel, this is an inherently doomed system, which again, for Hegel is a good thing, because it means you will be forced to break out of it in time. And Hegel's reading, in his early theological readings, literally he means the emergence of Jesus. In his later philosophical writings, he will really talk about the emergence of Christianity, but as we will see, for him it really amounts to the same thing. The key turning point, and as you'll see, a radically different reading than Nietzsche will later give, the key turning point is the emergence of Christianity. And the reason it's so important is one piece of it, as we saw with his philosophy of art 2 weeks ago, but just to quickly remind you, with the incarnation, what this means is you get, and for Hegel this is a good thing for all of its dangers, and hence it's the need of resolution, but you get this fundamental tension between the divine, which enters into a human body, and therefore creates this radical tension between spirit, or soul, and body. Body is limited, structured, it is a form. Divinity is radically infinite, and insofar as it becomes incarnate in a human form, it is forced to be limited, and therefore you create a fundamental tension between spirit and body, which, of course, for Hegel is good, right? Tensions are what drive things. And then as we noted in his philosophy of art, once this sets in, it takes 1,500 years to play out to his own day, but once this sets in, it will set in a progressive development in which that tension will lead to, ultimately, a breakdown of the entire earlier world. In his early theological writings, it's not quite as radical, but it's getting at basically the same thing. So when here he is talking, in these writings I mean, about Christian love and hope, the key for him is what Jesus in this reading is doing, is saying to all humans, instead of simply following the law with all of the dangerous implications that by definition for Hegel will create, instead you are getting a divine love that supersedes all possible understanding of what this could mean, where it's coming from, and why it would be given to absolutely everyone. And insofar as it does, it breaks our need, our reliance on simply following a positive law, because now our failures can be rescued, even explained, because we are seen as incapable of always following the law, but we have this radical love given to us that can allow for our resurgence nonetheless. And in the early theological writings, it is radical love and radical hope that creates this fundamental break from the structured world of simply following positive law. Unlike Nietzsche, in other words, where love is simply a slave morality, for Hegel, It, on the contrary, is this radical love that breaks us from simply following or being required, and therefore failing, to simply follow laws. Now, he doesn't work out the full implications in the pieces you've read in the early theological writings, but let me just quickly do so to see how this will fit into his larger arguments when he develops them about a decade later. So the full argument will then be, once this sets in, it again will create this fundamental tension, again for Hegel always a good thing, this fundamental tension between the limits of any set of laws, whether human or divinely given, and this radical love that would mean radical egalitarian universalism that opens up the possibilities of a radical form of connection way beyond simply individuals following laws and therefore acting properly toward each other. And for Hegel, this is important because once you get that drive, you get the possible sense, or possible sense meaning literally early on the possible sense that then plays out historically over the millennium and a half to come, you get the sense that therefore all humans are equally failing, but all humans are also equally deserving of this radical love that should connect all humans together. And for Hegel, this is the key that will set in forth that same kind of a drive that in the arts he's talking about in terms of spirit in the body. Because once you get that claim, then by definition, no set of laws can ever be adequate to the radical form of love, and it will force the creation of radically new forms of political activity and, in his case, a radically new philosophy that will finally forge the connection of absolutely everything. Now, let me also say a few words about this final synthesis, because that too, we will see, will open up some larger questions for us. So once this sets in, what happens? Well, for Hegel, one piece of it, sort of the entire piece we were discussing first with Emerson and Nietzsche, although these are figures, of course, coming after Hegel, Hegel is brilliant. I mean, he does see sort of how things will play out philosophically if they're allowed to play out. And in a sense, he kind of already gives them a place. So he sees that as playing out in notions, for him earlier, this develops in the 18th century, but in radical notions of, for example, Kantian autonomy. And for him, this is limited, right? And so for Kant, again, now we're going back to our very first real session, our second week, remember Kant was the figure who argued that absolute moral activity involved individuals autonomously choosing to follow universal laws. So it's not that there are laws that we follow, it's that we autonomously give ourselves, we legislate for ourselves the laws that we will follow, and the criterion by which we will do so is they must be universalizable for absolutely every single human being. And we saw the dangerous way that got taken up in the Anglo-American academic tradition. But the key for Kant is this notion of the autonomous subject freely choosing how to legislate for himself his own life, the key being, it must be, therefore, absolutely universalizable. Now, for Hegel, this is the working out of Christian notions of love, right? So it's universalizable. It is based not on simply following laws, but autonomous agents choosing to follow laws that they themselves create, so they become the legislators of their own legal system because they are autonomous individuals. And for Hegel, this is, again, it's a good thing in the sense that it's working out of the dialectic. For him, it is also, however, very limited because you're still resting your system on the autonomous individual. And Hegel's claim to achieve a final synthesis philosophically, but he lays it out in political theory too, in terms of what this would mean, is the final synthesis would involve both a radically autonomous individual and yet a radically autonomous individual successfully living in a world in which all autonomous individuals would be able to work together autonomously and yet fully connected with themselves. In other words, avoiding the kind of radical claim of nonconformity that will play out in extreme forms later with a figure like Nietzsche, and yet also avoiding the kind of radical form of absolute sort of like a system in which everyone will perfectly fit in that will play out in other isms, say, for example, extreme forms of communism as they will play out in the 20th century. And the argument is, no, the final synthesis would involve both of these. Now, that's a rather lengthy discussion of Hegel, but my reason for taking you through this is I think it opens up for us some very intriguing questions, because Hegel, note, is writing all of this in the early 19th century. Part of his brilliance is he was able to see, in a sense, kind of what would play out if each of these positions were allowed to play out to its extremity, as opposed to the kind of dialectic leading, in his opinion, to a proper synthesis. And needless to say, one way of reading the various strands we've been looking at is, on the contrary, each has played out to its extremity. So part of what would concern Hegel about the radical notion of individual autonomy, it plays out probably in a more scary way than he had imagined in terms of the Nietzsche and the misreadings of Nietzsche over the 2 centuries to come. But if you read his discussions of that, that's basically, you could almost read it as a critique in advance of that position. When he is discussing notions of romanticism, I mean, again, he's writing in the early 19th century, but he already foresees the way that will be playing out. And as we discussed, he is correctly seeing, look, this will just create an endless dynamic that won't lead to a resolution if it's allowed to play out endlessly, of just individuals constantly trying to break against a social structure, but you'll never try to create a social structure in which they could actually live and thrive together. And lo and behold, that plays out. And in the second half of today's session, when we get to desire, same critique. One of his concerns will be what happens if you create a system in which you have the individual with a set of desires that are inherent to that individual, and your sole goal is simply to allow that individual to play out those desires. To Hegel, this is disastrous, absolutely horrible. And intriguingly, in a sense, therefore, Hegel foresees all of the dangers that we have been discussing. What is his solution? I suspect we're not going to be fully convinced by it, but it might be philosophically helpful for us to ask why, when we therefore pose the larger question of these next 2 weeks of how we might be able to rethink the project more productively. So in a sense, Hegel is going to rest his entire rereading of this project kind of as a radicalization of notions of Christian love. I mean, that's essentially what he is trying to get at here. And if you see what he is talking about in these early theological writings as being so key in the teachings attributed to Jesus, basically this is what Hegel is going to try to do at a much, much larger level. Say, could we create an entire socio-political world in which you would have autonomous individuals able to flourish because there would be a proper sense of absolute connection of everything that, for him, comes out initially from the sense of, claim of, radical egalitarian love for all figures universally and equally. And this is how Hegel is going to try to do it. And he is going to try to build a system that, had it been successful, needless to say it was not, had it been successful, it would have been a perfect blending of a lot of the key isms that will play out of this project over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. It would have been a perfect blending of sort of liberal political ideology based upon autonomous individuals. It would have been a blending of that with the sense of socialism, of building a social structure in which not simply those individuals can flourish by following their self-interest, which is the liberal model, which for Hegel is unacceptable, but rather a social structure in which they would actually be able to grow from each other, and indeed, even sort of pieces of what would later become communism in the sense of a kind of radical, perfect sharing of absolutely everything. Now, when I say he didn't quite achieve this, he actually thought it was being achieved. So he thought the Prussian state that he was living within was actually achieving this, that Napoleon had broken the bonds of feudalism through his conquest, this grand heroic individual, but for Hegel that's good as a dialectic, but you don't want to stop with the heroic individuals, and he thought the Prussian state was finally building a perfect bureaucratic system that would allow individuals to flourish, but not as radical individuals, but rather pull them together into a single system where everyone would be working together. Now, this is of interest because I suspect none of us in this room would say the Prussian state is exactly an ideal system and hardly a perfect synthesis of all possible philosophical positions and any possible political theory. But it's also, I think, for us, a very intriguing question to think through. Because I think what Hegel's getting at, even if his ultimate answer is exceedingly unsatisfying, I think what he is getting at, perhaps more than any other single figure we've read so far, at really the fundamental tension. I mean, if one of the problems I suspect we had in reading in Nietzsche is that by taking the notion of the radical, non-conforming individual to such an extreme, it took out any possibility of a political project of how you would build a world where people could actually flourish in some manner, shape, or form by helping each other. Similarly, Romanticism, by definition, does the same thing because, by definition, the world that we see around us of structure, by definition, can be nothing other than something that holds us back, which takes out, by definition, the question, how would you actually build a social order where we could flourish? In Romanticism, you can't, by definition. There's a fundamental opposition between the infinite spirit and the structured world of the finite. And we will see momentarily when we get to desire, many similar problems, to put it mildly. The intriguing move of Hegel is to say, well, can you build out of, in his opinion, Christian notions of love, but they're not uniquely Christian. We'll see these exist in many traditions. Could you build out of this a vision, philosophically and politically, where you would both wrestle with the claims of a project of self-construction and yet also wrestle with the question of how you can build a social world where this social construction would not only be allowed, but even supported precisely through connections that you would have with others. Hegel, I think, fails to pull this off, but I think he's posing one of the key questions that we need to wrestle with. If we're going to pursue this project and take it philosophically seriously, which obviously we want to do for each of the projects we'll be exploring, I think that is the right question to ask. And unlike in Nietzsche, unlike radical claims of Romanticism, certainly unlike claims based upon desire that we'll be getting to in the second half of our session, it is an intriguing question to ask. Could you get out of this notion of radical love something that would both support the project of self-construction and allow a connectivity in which others would not simply be a restriction on our freedom, simply be part of a structure that holds us down, but actually part of what it would mean to be able to construct ourselves powerfully. So Hegel, even if a failure and a politically chilling figure in terms of many of the larger implications, I think he also raises for us very key philosophical questions and probably more productive ways of thinking of notions of love than, say, Nietzsche's vision, where this is simply nothing but a herd morality to hold back the radically great individual. So, with that as a quick opening statement, should we open things up again to continue our discussion of Christian love and hope? And we'll just, as always, allow that to play out as it does, and then at a certain point, shift gears and turn to the entire theme of desire, yet another version coming out of this. Yes, please.
Before that, I think we should continue this discussion of Christianity.
Yes.
And take as long as we need to take. But let's first open up.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yes. No, I mean after that discussion. Yes. So let us open up. Christian love and hope writ large, philosophically. We assume by this you're fully convinced by Hegel. And the Prussian state is the way to go. Yes, please.
Louder, please.
I said one thing that I find interesting about incorporating religious belief into the philosophical system is the idea that life on Earth is not the end all and be all, and that the self is not simply a material feature, but rather a spiritual feature, and that his final end is not his death, but rather his transition into an afterlife, and so it encompasses a much wider spectrum of the idea of what a soul's existence is, which I think adds, a layer of depth, I think, when we talk about Christian hope versus the material self.
I very much agree. And just to underline your point, let me make a contrast with, say, liberal political theory, not liberal in the sense of the Democratic Party, but I mean liberal political theories that developed in the 19th century, which we saw a piece of in our second week when we were discussing the moral theories that are sort of part and parcel of this, which absolutely take for granted that all of the great religious attempts to rethink the world should basically be ignored, minus one strand of them that should be thought of in a purely secularized sense, and that sense would simply be all individuals are, at their best, rational agents who must learn how to rationally live together so that they can most fulfill their self-interest without too infringing upon others. And we saw it. You can work this out in many different ways, and people in political theory have tried to for 2 centuries, but basically what you also do by implication is you take out all the questions you're turning to. You take out all of the larger questions about what humans potentially are capable of. You take out all potential questions about questioning our grounded assumptions that are creating this one political order. In other words, you sort of take out all of the assumptions that every religious tradition has ever grappled with. And I agree. I think part of the power of reading Hegel, the reason we've assigned him and the reason I would highly recommend all of you read more of him, even though you'll find him infuriating, but read more of him is in part for this reason, because Hegel is absolutely committed, although I think with non-Western religions he fails, but in the early 19th century he's dealing with a limited body of translations, but he is at least trying to grapple with, and he's philosophically committed to claiming he's fully grappling with and fully taking philosophically seriously every single philosophical position and every single religious tradition that has ever arisen in the world. Now, again, he doesn't do that. Obviously, he doesn't live up to that goal. But insofar as that is his goal, it means at least with things he knows well, and Christianity obviously is the one he does know very well, he wrestles with it at an incredibly high level of philosophical seriousness because he thinks you need to take it seriously. Unlike a lot of 19th century political theorists that will sort of just say, all of that should be cut out of our discussion.
But that doesn't mean that there's some easy halfway house between religious faith and philosophical reason, and that somehow there's a way of injecting the concerns of a religion into philosophy without actually having any religious faith. That's a confusion. And it's a confusion that's very widespread in contemporary culture. So one can have the idea, and it's something that I do want to speak with after our conversation here about your remarks, that this project that we're discussing of nonconformity and self-invention could go on 2 different tracks. It could go on the purely secular or profane track, and it could go on a theological track. But they're not the same. And there's no easy translation of one to the other. And there's no way of reducing the sacred one to the profane one while evading the imperative of religious faith. But I'll postpone that and speak to that right after this exchange.
I do agree, although the one addendum I'd make, though, is it strikes me that Hegel, more I think than really any 19th century thinker, at least tries to do this, even though I think he fails, but I think he attempts to do that more than any other single figure in the 19th century. Again, he fails, but I think it's an heroic attempt for us if we want to philosophically really interrogate and take seriously religions. And I think Hegel fails but tries.
Yes, at the
Yeah.
cost of a solution which, to my mind, is not really faithful to the doctrines or the spirit of Christianity.
I agree. Yes, yes. His final solution is painfully inadequate. Yes.
By that standard. But
Yes.
so it may be inadequate in some ways in the sense of it not being true, but it's also inadequate in another way in the sense of not being true to Christianity.
Yes, yes. Yeah, no, I think that's very true. Yes. Yes, please.
Yeah, so I mentioned throughout the course, throughout the history of philosophy, right? Many philosophers have tried to, come up with, this grand unified theory that
Yes.
really incorporates all of the previous schools of philosophy.
Yep.
And I'm just curious as to why it is Hegel's, dialectic that really stands out in like the history of Western thought as like the unified
Yeah.
kind of philosophical thought that unifies like all pre-existing philosophers.
Stands out to whom? So there's no agreement that Hegel is somehow the modern Aristotle. Analytical philosophers on the whole regard Hegel as a charlatan, as Schopenhauer did even in Hegel's time. So there's no such consensus. One of the most famous analytical philosophers in Anglo-American philosophy told me the following, and it's characteristic of the attitude to Hegel, just as a comment on what you just said. He said he had attempted to read Hegel's Logic, which is one of Hegel's main work. But when he got to the third page of Hegel's Logic, he saw that Hegel repudiated the principle of contradiction, and then he abandoned the effort. So much for the agreement that Hegel is the synthesizer. There is no such agreement.
Although I will, just to quickly add on this, to add another name that we're not reading, but you might find interesting. For those who do try to continue this project, another figure very worth reading is a social scientist who will try to do this minus the final synthesis. So it both takes out the most problematic part of Hegel and yet also arguably the most exciting, at least in his attempt to do so. But the figure I'm thinking about comes a century later. His name is Max Weber. And Weber's basic move is to say, can we do Hegel now that we actually know something about non-Western civilizations, which Hegel just didn't. I mean, when you read what he says about the non-West, it's painful, but he's obviously going on the existing translations of the time. By the early 20th century, it's still pretty painful, but much better. And Weber will try to essentially do this. Now, again, he's taking out the final attempt at the synthesis. But Weber's question is to say, how do we actually understand all of the traditions, in religious traditions, but equally economic, political, etc., throughout the world, and what happens if we try to work out how they play out historically leading up to the current moment. Now, again, he takes out what Hegel cares most about, but the reason I mention it in response is he still wants to say, if you do this, you see a limited number of possible ways of thinking about the world that have played out historically, and then for Weber, it's all about thinking through the implications. So Buddhism plays out things slightly this way, Confucianism this way, Christianity this way. I personally find his way of doing so very unsatisfying. But I think it's for us an intriguing attempt, because it's an attempt to say, if you think comparatively, does it force us to question our assumptions at levels that may be impossible with simply an interrogation of any one tradition? And if Hegel is unsatisfying, if Weber in a different way is unsatisfying, it's still, I think, an intriguing question. Could you do this more productively? I mean, in part, this course is an attempt to say, hopefully, yes. Great, thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah, Professor Pruitt, so you mentioned that, you talked about the significance of radical love and the role it plays in
Yes.
Hegel's view of his final synthesis.
Yes.
What exactly, what does it look like? Are there any examples that Hegel points to maybe in the Prussian state that you brought up of this radical love in practice? And for Professor Unger, like how does that somehow heretical or different from the conventional or orthodox Christian view that you think Hegel fails to live up to in his solution?
Well, let me postpone my remarks because I want to speak following. So after your answer, Michael, I'll then go on.
Absolutely. Okay. So, and I'll be brief because unfortunately, the Prussian state part of his argument is the least powerful. So very briefly, what Krishnov really, the reason it's important for him is when he's giving the final synthesis that politically will be the Prussian state, but for him it's really a full philosophical synthesis. For him, the key is every single position that has ever existed needs a place within his system. By the very fact that it's existed means it's played out and needs a place. And so he has to account for absolutely everything, giving it its proper place. But the key for that also is once it's given its proper place, it will be able to work productively with every other position, as opposed to these tensions that for him are key, but they're also by definition in a good way unstable, requiring more work and later resolutions and the creation of more dialectics. And for Hegel, it's clear when you go from the early theological readings that you're seeing a piece of to his more mature writings where he's laying out his system. Basically, sort of the connecting glue, to use a very inadequate metaphor, is this same notion of radical love that he's talking about in the early theological writings. It would be this absolute connection of everything, and in terms of political theory, absolute connection of everyone in a way that would go beyond any set of simple laws, moral system, etc., which for him by definition is going to be inadequate and unstable. Now, again, the Prussian state is the least satisfying piece of this, where he claims that this is being achieved. But the reason it's still intriguing for us to think about is basically what he is trying to wrestle with in a way that Nietzsche did not wrestle with, Romantics absolutely couldn't wrestle with, is could you create a social structure that would be amenable to the work of human beings connecting with each other? So in other words, the social structure wouldn't simply be a limit to our greatness or our radical creativity, our radical innovation, where the social structure actually would be part of the connections that we would all hope to have with each other, and in fact would even be productive of our abilities to do so. Now, again, Hegel's, I think, solution for that is woefully inadequate, but I think that's what he's trying to wrestle with. And that's why I think it's philosophically interesting, even if we're not convinced by his response. And with that, do you want to?
Yes, absolutely. So even though we had announced that the second half of the class would be about this apparent escape from the project of nonconformity and self-invention, which in the syllabus we call the paradise of desire, I do want to press on the significance of Christianity for this project. And I believe we should take as much time as we need to pursue this very important subject. So the question that I raise is, to what extent is the relation of Christianity to this project that we're discussing not simply a historical curiosity, an allusion to one of the sources of these ideas in the history of belief, but a connection that is living now or can be made living and can be brought to bear not just on the understanding of this project, but on its reconstruction. And so I want to begin first by situating Christianity in the history of religion and in its relation to its sister religions, Judaism and Islam, before I come to this question. So first, all of the great world religions, if we define religion capaciously, inclusively, to include, for example, Buddhism and Confucianism, and not simply the Near Eastern salvation religions, the religions of the Bible. All of these religions, despite the enormous differences among them, share certain elements in common. First, what they share is the desanctification of the natural world and the introduction of what we call a dialectic between transcendence and immanence. Nature itself is not sacred. The divine transcends the natural world and nevertheless re-enters the world and participates in it in some form. Second, all of these religions affirmed that the divisions within humanity, the divisions of caste, of class, of gender, of culture, are shallow, and that humanity is fundamentally one. Third, all of these religions rejected what had up to that moment been the predominant ethic of the rulers and of the fighters, an ethic of martial valor, of self-assertion, of pride, of vengeance. And they rejected it in favor of an ethic of universal fellow feeling. The fourth common element of all of these religions is that their concern ceased to be the dependence of mankind on nature, on its powers and dangers, and became instead the focus on these ineradicable flaws in the human condition. That we will die, that the character of existence is enigmatic, our groundlessness, and that our desires are insatiable. We're surrounded only by the limited, and we nevertheless want the unlimited. And a fifth characteristic of all of these world religions is that in approaching all of these problems, to which the other four characteristics refer, there is a pervasive ambiguity. What are these religions inviting us to do? Are they inviting us to redescribe the world, to understand it in a different way? Or are they inviting us to change the world? Do they provide us with a provocation to transform? Or do they supply us with a ticket to escape? Now then, among these religions are the three Semitic monotheisms: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. That in contrast to the other world religions, share two salient characteristics. The first characteristic is that they conceive the divine under the category of personality. And the transactions between God and humanity, by analogy to the transactions among people. And thus this idea of the analogical reading. So our relations to one another in history are enveloped within this larger framework of relations to God. but the fundamental currency or medium is the same, which is personality and relations among people. The second salient shared characteristic of these Semitic monotheisms, by contrast to all of the others, is that they affirm the decisive character of time, including historical time. The sacred vocation, the destiny of humanity, is to be acted out in history. It's not confined to history, but it takes place in history and then goes beyond history. So history is not epiphenomenal or cyclical. History is a decisive scene of redemptive action or of the failure of redemption. Now then comes the third step in these remarks, which is having contrasted the three Semitic monotheisms to the other religions, I now want to contrast Christianity to the other two, Judaism and Islam. And Christianity differs from the other two, or at least from the predominant tendencies in the other two, in two crucial respects. First, it differs by the centrality that it gives to love as the defining spiritual experience, and to these twin themes of love and infinity that in Christianity are inseparable from each other. And the second way in which it differs from the other two is its antinomian impulse, its opposition to rules and to structure. In the predominant doctrinal tendencies of the other two, the law has centrality, the halacha or the sharia. And of course, there are countercurrents in these other religions, especially in the mystical tendencies in these other religions that demote or contain the centrality of the law. But in Christianity, the law was never central. So there is canon law, but it's just an ecclesiastical normative order. There's natural law, which is a theory of the theologians. And then there are the occasional attempts of the church or the churches to propose an institutional doctrine regarding how society should be organized. But these attempts have, on the whole, been short-lived and unsuccessful. Christianity, in its predominant tendency, has always been an antinomian religion. Now, having defined then the specific character by opposition to the predominant tendencies in Judaism and in Islam, the question is, how would Christianity have to be reinterpreted or revised so that it could become immediately proximate to this project that we're debating, the project of nonconformity and self-invention? And I want to claim that there are three crucial elements. All of them are theological projects within Christianity itself. That is, these three areas of dispute to which I'm now going to point are living disputes within Christianity and always have been. they're not just remarks from the outside by an outsider about how Christianity would have to change in order to be able to communicate more directly with this project of nonconformity and self-invention. So the first crucial point is the break with the Greek philosophy of being, represented classically by Aristotle, but a pervasive theme in the history of Western philosophy. So the most important philosophers and theologians in all three Semitic monotheisms made their peace with the Greek philosophy of being. Thomas Aquinas in Christianity, Averroes, Ibn Rushd in Islam, and Maimonides in Judaism. But one would have to say, as a believer and as a Christian theologian, that the Greek philosophy of being is incompatible with Christianity. The Greek philosophy of being, the impersonal is higher than the personal. And there is a permanent structure of reality, the basic constituents of the world and the basic regularities that govern these permanent constituents of the world. And on the contrary, in this other interpretation of Christianity, the personal is higher and deeper than the impersonal. And time, including historical time, goes all the way down. Nothing is outside of it. There is no eternal set of constituents or regularities. The second central subject of dispute has to do with the distinction between love and altruism. Love is not altruism in all the ways that we previously discussed. And what must be central to Christianity, and central for Christianity for it to communicate with this project, is to affirm not just the centrality of love, but the radical difference between love and altruism. And the third theme of dispute, then, is to recognize the fundamental disparity between the Christian message and the different organized regimes that have existed in societies that see their religion as Christianity. So the history of these societies is a history of a series of compromises between the practical organization of social and economic life and the Christian message. For example, the feudal ethic of chivalry, or the Victorian ethic of familial responsibility, or today, the ethic of political correctness in the relations among people. From the standpoint of Christianity on this view, all of these ethics are defective, and they are perversions of the Christian message, and there's no way in which Christianity could be brought down to their level. There is a permanent imperative of transformation, of negation, of rebellion, which is intimately connected with the antinomian impulse in Christianity. Now, if we took the three positions that I just described as positions within Christianity, then Christianity would become immediately relevant to this project. And the barriers, the walls would come down. But we wouldn't take these positions in order to do that. It's that this is what we would believe as Christians if we were conducting this dispute as a debate within Christianity. And now I'm looking ahead to the following point. We're going to come next week or after to this debate about how this project can and should be revised in order to be less susceptible to the defects, to the flaws that we've already discussed in it. And the question then is whether this project of criticism and of revision can go on two tracks: a profane track of secular reason and a sacred track of religious faith, of faith, in this case, within Christianity. There's no easy halfway house. There's no compromise between these two tracks. They would be parallel, but they would not be convergent. And the reason why they would not be convergent, and that there's no simple way of splitting the difference between them, is that secular reason, the reason of the philosophers, faces certain insuperable obstacles in trying to accommodate to the religion. So what are these obstacles? They are what in an earlier dispute I called the scandals of reason. So first there is the obstacle of supernaturalism, of the suspension of the workings of nature. For example, in Christianity, the doctrine of the incarnation, or the doctrine of the virginal birth of Christ, or the doctrine of the resurrection of the body. Second, there is the scandal of the way in which a particularistic and highly accidental and contingent plot, a narrative, can be the vehicle of a universal message. So this is one of the characteristics of these religions. There's a particular accidental history, which is then the setting of the universal message. Why should God have become incarnate in the person of a Palestinian peasant in a peripheral province of the Roman Empire? And so this secular reason is unable to understand this combination of the universal and the particular. The third scandal is the incoherence of the idea of God. So what are the ideas of God that are available in this theological tradition? There are basically three ideas. God can be a person. But then we have the problem of an anthropomorphic projection, which secular reason is unable to accept. God can be a being, impersonal, but then this impersonal idea is incompatible with the faith of the religion. Or we can say, as the mystical theologians say, just negatively, God is to be defined as non-being and non-person. But this seems to be an abdication of the task of secular reason. And then there's a fourth problem, different in character from the other three, which is that the actual experience of participation in one of these faiths is an experience of realizing that the vast majority of the adherents to the faith are adherents just because their parents were, So there is, to be sure, the experience of conversion, but it's peripheral. And what kind of a belief is this, in which you believe in something because your mother and father believed in it? So one would have to say that the core of the faith is this idea that there's an event in which God, the transcendent, takes you by storm, and somehow the experience wears on its face, the attributes of its irresistibility, which cannot adequately be translated into the discourse of secular reason. Now, what happens, in fact, in the world, in contemporary societies around the world, is that many people would like to believe who are unable to believe. So there is a sentimental will to belief. The American philosopher William James said, people believe everything they can. But often they can't believe, even if they want to. And so then there is this halfway house between believing and not believing, in which the doctrines of the religion are, quote, demythologized and understood as some kind of allegory of a series of secular beliefs. This is the halfway house between belief and unbelief, the sentimental will to believe, which is a kind of self-deception, pretending that this abyss, this discontinuity between faith and unfaith does not exist. And in practice, this sentimental religion is completely superfluous, because what it ends up doing is to be simply another description of the moral and political pieties of the day. So what do we need religion for, if it is not a storm that takes us in a direction in which we don't want to go? If it's just another vocabulary in which to restate the moral and political pieties in which we believe anyway. So I'm claiming that there's no easy compromise. There's no direct passage between the secular register and the religious one, between the sacred and the profane. Now, suppose we had recognized all of this and done all of this and revised our understanding of Christianity in the way I had described. Those are all active positions within the theological disputes within Christianity. And then this struggle to debate the content of the project of self-invention and nonconformity would go on in parallel in these two different tracks. And we would see what would happen. There's still one formidable problem that would remain. And that would involve a substantial transformation of the content of the religion, in this case of the content of Christianity. So it's different from those other three problems, because those other three problems are recognized disputes within Christian theology and philosophy. A major strand in the evolution of Christianity and of Christian theology is a strand that goes from Paul, St. Paul, described by many of the historians of Christianity as the real inventor of the religion, to Augustine, and then in the 19th century to theologians like Schleiermacher and in the 20th century to theologians like Karl Barth. So in the vocabulary of Protestantism, it is the strand, the tradition, that emphasizes the absolute predominance of grace over works and the absolute dependence of man, of the person, on God. And we don't know what to call this, whether this is the orthodoxy or it's a heresy, because in a way one might say it's a kind of heresy, but it's the heresy that has often seemed to be the orthodoxy because of its tremendous influence on the evolution of the religion. But there is a countervailing tendency in the history of this religion, which is played up in other variants, for example, in Orthodox Christianity. And the countervailing tendency has to do with the participation of the human personality in the divine life. And we can find it surprisingly even in the most orthodox theologians, like Thomas Aquinas. So Aquinas says in one of his sermons, God became man so that men could become gods. Gods meaning to participate in the divine life. And in Orthodox Christianity, there is the theology of deification. God becomes man by condescension, and man becomes God by grace. So it's the elevation to a higher form of life, a participation in the divine life. That is the theme in Christianity that has the deepest relation with the central hope of this tradition that we're studying of self-invention and nonconformity. We saw it in Nietzsche and Emerson. In Emerson, the idea that the individual is like the vehicle through which this divine force is flowing, or in Nietzsche's allusion to these powers. So this is all then to justify the claim with which I began these remarks, that we don't have to see the relation of Christianity to this project as simply a matter of historical causation. But it is a relation that has a life, that has meaning, that has a bearing right now on the basis of all these stipulations that I enumerated. And that therefore the engagement with this project can take place simultaneously but distinctly in these two registers of the profane and the sacred, but that there's no passageway, no easy passageway from one to another. And that the claim that they're all somehow part of some mush, some convergence, some alliance, is really a monstrosity of self-deception in which we deny ourselves insight into what is at stake.
Let's open this up.
So this is all by way, in a way, this all bears on your comment before. Why not inject the religious into the philosophical? And I'm saying yes and no. So yes, in the sense that all of this debate can be rephrased and continued in this second way, but that it's a fateful division of roads, and they're not the same thing. Yes?
So, I might just be misunderstanding, but in terms of Christianity, it seems like there
participates in the divine life, yes.
Yeah, but from my understanding, humility is also a big theme in Christianity. And
Yes.
you say that like radical individual self-construction is a big concept here, but there's also like the Ten Commandments and some degree of Christian law. And so
Yes.
I guess I'm wondering about the tension between these things and how it
Absolutely. So maybe your very important question, very pertinent, is a way of anticipating the discussion of the flaws and of the correction of this project, right? So let's just remember the flaws. So, because this whole debate now, this conversation we're having about Christianity, bears on this. So the first flaw is an inadequate understanding of the relation between self and others, or between self-construction and solidarity. So in the unrevised form, the project evokes the little Napoleon who crowns himself, the self-reliant man in Nietzsche, the great man, the self-reliant man in Emerson, the great man in Nietzsche, and so forth. As opposed to the idea that no one saves himself. And self-construction works through connection, and then there's the problem of the dangers of connection. Now, that comment can be generalized into a claim that this project in its untransformed mode is susceptible to the danger of what you could call Prometheanism. So Prometheism is this idea that we make ourselves bigger, and we make ourselves bigger attempting to share not just the divine attribute of transcendence, but also the divine attributes of omnipotence and omniscience. And this then would be a perversion and a self-deception. Then the third flaw is the one that's brought out by Romanticism in one direction and by Hegel in another, which is we either deify a particular structure and treat it as definitive, or we despair of any structure and we imagine that spiritual life can exist only in those interludes in which we shake the structures. When what we really need to do is over time to change the relation between structure and spirit. That then leads to the fourth inadequacy, which is this project seems to have no politics. And what is its politics? A politics of deep freedom requires a series of institutional innovations. And then a fifth defect is that a fundamental one is that this project seems to be in some way empty. So we become bigger, more powerful, more self-reliant, and then what? What do we do with our freedom? And what it is not recognizing is that everything that is valuable to us arises from engagements and connections in particular domains. And therefore, we need a way of thinking of self-construction that doesn't sever the link with those connections and those engagements. It seems to me that that this task of criticizing the project and revising it is a task to which this reinterpreted Christianity for the believer would have a great deal to say. And it would be a version of the project against Prometheanism, therefore speaking to your to your point about humility, accepting our vulnerability, not a beating of the drums in the presence of death, not a form of triumphalism. And then this would be a conversation that could take place in both a profane and a sacred register. For the project to be acceptable to a Christian, it would have to deal with all of these problems. If it did not deal with all of these problems, it would be a form of megalomania. It would be a Promethean rebellion against the human condition and the relation between man and God. But that's not to say that you need to be a believer in order to criticize the project in all of those ways and to seek to reshape it in all of those ways. It's just to say that you could come to this from these two different points of departure. Yes.
Professor Unger, I was wondering if you could say more about the relationship between Christianity and Greek Catholic philosophy.
Yes.
Aquinas was Platonist,
Yes.
philosopher, and Augustine.
Absolutely. These were the most important philosophers in those three religions.
Correct. And I was wondering if one way of interpreting Christianity is to trace its origins to Socratic philosophy and not to Platonic philosophy. Maybe by equating those types of philosophies, Christianity becomes another way of thinking how humankind connects with others, and through maybe dialogue and other kinds of engagements, Christianity can be interpreted.
No Christian could accept that idea. That's a reduction of Christianity to a kind of historical allegory. Christ was born in Palestine and died on the cross. And it's a dramatic turn of events. It's not something that has to do with Socrates, but the fundamental claim about the incompatibility of these religions with the Greek philosophy of being, the Semitic monotheisms, is that they affirm the primacy of the personal over the impersonal. This is in complete opposition to the Greek philosophy of being. In the Greek philosophy of being, the most real is the impersonal. And the source of ultimate reality and value lies in the impersonal. And if time is real, it's not completely real, because what is most real is exempt from time. And what is most real are the permanent constituents of the world and the permanent regularities governing these constituents, as opposed to the idea that nothing is outside of time and that everything that is real is mutable and transitional, which is another conception. Now, it is astonishing that the most influential philosophers in these three religions were, in the sense, disciples of Aristotle and accepted as their point of departure the Greek philosophy of being. This was not universally accepted, because then a philosopher like Pascal insisted on distinguishing correctly the God of the Bible from the God of the philosophers. So that seems to be a fundamental distinction. Now, we can construct, this goes back to an earlier conversation we had here. We can imagine a philosophical position that makes sense of these ideas. Not religious faith, but the ideas of the singular existence of the world, the inclusive reality of time, the open character of history. It turns out that that philosophical position has never been developed in the history of philosophy with the degree of detail and influence and constancy that the Greek philosophy of being has been developed, or that the speculative monism of ancient India has been developed. A 20th century philosopher, Heidegger, wrote a book, his main work, called Time and Being. But he said, if one day I were to write a theology, the word being would never occur in it. And so this is speaking to this question of the incompatibility of the Christian view with this Greek philosophy of being.
Articulated a very compelling image from the point of view of Hegel. The autonomous individuals acting with full agency to create this harmonious, connected world. Did he have descriptions for how to get people to that place of becoming a fully autonomous agent, operating, making choices? When you talk about institutions, when you talk about education or laws?
My honest answer is I think it's one of the weakest parts of Hegel, is that in truth, no, or rather more honestly, yes, but it's very unsatisfying. And so philosophically, the way he would be committed, but I'll be putting it in very abstract terms as he does, despite the concrete examples that seem very unconvincing. But putting it abstractly as he does, the answer would be a notion of a radically autonomous individual in itself is too dangerous because it will lead to, and again, historically he was proven correct in this, to a position like Nietzsche and all of its dangerous implications. So his view was Kant trying to focus on the autonomous individual was inadequate because it ultimately is going to lead to a world of Nietzsche, where you give up the claim of universal laws and the self-legislating autonomous individual becomes radically autonomous. So fundamentally dangerous. A view that you try to build a society based upon mutual relations to him is also inadequate because it will simply lead to conformity and involve all the dangers of simply having people follow positive laws that he thinks has played out repeatedly, and as we saw in the early theological writings, he thinks is doomed. So philosophically, he would claim, ultimately what you would do is get both, where an individual's radical autonomy would be seen as inherently interconnected with everyone else's, and therefore you would get a world that would be both individual and communal, in which you would both have individual flourishing and yet a communal world that would support that individual flourishing, and with that individual flourishing would not destroy the communal world. Now, to finally then get back to the heart of your question, what does this look like on the ground? Again, it's deeply unsatisfying. He thought the Prussian state was accomplishing in this, and I think most of us would say no. But in terms of why he would say yes, in terms of concretely what this would mean, clearly what he's thinking about here is the creation of a state that would have laws that would be applicable to everyone equally. So to him, one of the key things that that Napoleon does when he breaks through Europe and destroys the feudal bonds, which for Hegel is a wonderful thing, it actually creates a universal state with universal laws that would apply to everyone equally. But in Napoleonic form, of course, it's inadequate because, of course, it requires this radically heroic individual, which for Hegel involves all sorts of dangers. And so, therefore, the Prussian state coming after takes the Napoleonic Code, takes this universal set of laws that would apply to everyone equally, but then builds it into a system in which those individuals who are properly educated can then move up into the ranks. And once this occurs, the claim is, and it's one of the key things you mentioned in your question, you would need an educational system to support this, and therefore you would have a bureaucratic state made up of a largely educated elite. Now, I'm using all of these terms to bring in an historically intriguing fact, but something that will be philosophically interesting to all of us. So, is he really even talking about the Prussian state? The answer is to some extent yes, but actually you can trace a lot of the terms he's using that I was just quoting. He's pulling this from Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century that he's reinterpreting now post-Napoleonic Code. And where did they get this? It was from Jesuit writings on China. And so the truth is, despite Hegel's claim that all of the non-West is this world of stasis and horrible, the truth is a lot of his descriptions of the Prussian state actually have little to do with Prussia, but actually look a lot like the Enlightenment rereading of the bureaucratic and educational system of late imperial China. Now, I'm not saying it's an accurate reading, but that's actually, I think, really where Hegel's getting that. And that, again, raises an intriguing question to us that we'll sort of postpone for another 2 weeks, but very intriguing. As Roberto has mentioned, if we want to resurrect this project of self-construction, we're mentioning that the positive attempts by Hegel to wrestle with these ideas, but it can be said that ultimately he kind of gives up on key aspects of the project, and from a larger historical perspective, or comparative perspective, I would even say, he moves a lot closer to the position that we'll be discussing in well, 2 weeks our time, but 3 weeks in real time with the spring break, very much associated with the Confucian tradition, which is very intriguing. So he's a Christian thinker building a philosophical synthesis, and yet building more than I think he would even honestly want to admit on materials from elsewhere.
Is that, would you say, is it fair to say that he would believe that the autonomous individual would be amenable to a reason which was based on universally understand good?
Yes, although
shared that it was easier to persuade people as to making the right choices.
yes, although he would say all of that is really what Kant was arguing. And Hegel wants to say the synthesis would involve more than that because that claim still rests on the autonomous individual. And Hegel wants to say, but even sort of the basis that will give you an autonomous individual needs to be part of this synthesis. So he would say it would include that, but encompass even beyond that.
So the connection to politics is not a minor or peripheral problem. It's a central problem. So you can imagine two understandings of this project that we're discussing. On one understanding, the problem of politics, the organization of society, has already been solved. The details remain open, but the essential pattern has been established, adumbrated by Hegel. But don't think this is just a historical curiosity.
Oh, absolutely.
This is the belief now.
I was going to say, I
So
think that's the
now,
common assumption.
so now in the North Atlantic world, the dominant belief of the governing elites is that the central task is to reconcile the social protection of the Europeans with the economic flexibility of the Americans within a barely adjusted version of the inherited economic and political institutions. And then there's the problem of the construction of the individual against a political economic background that has already been stabilized. it looks completely different if you reject that assumption. And if you think that this existing structure is just a hodgepodge of accidental compromises, the outcome of a series of paths of least resistance, of ways of accommodating innovations that minimize disturbance to the dominant interest in ruling preconceptions, and that all the fundamental problems of the contemporary societies require structural change. And then in what direction? What kind of structural change? And then the problem of the construction of the individual becomes inseparable from the transformation of society. That leads to a different version of this project. And that is a fundamental difference. It's not a detail. And it seems to me, going back to the discussion of Christianity, is that a Christian could not accept the first view, could not accept the view that there's a definitive structure. That must be a heresy in Christianity, even though philosophers like Hegel defended that heresy. And it must be a fundamental mistake today in the secular understanding of political and economic life. What counts in politics and in social thought is structure, the understanding of structure, the reimagination of structure, and the remaking of structure. Everything that is important has to do with that. And then the construction of the individual is associated with that. So, for example, you might say, what is it that distinguishes or should distinguish a progressive today? It's not a commitment to a goal of equality. The goal of equality is important but subsidiary. It's a commitment to an idea of bigness and shared bigness. So the progressive is distinguished from the conservative because the progressive insists on the idea that any genuine greatness must be constructed together. It must be shared. And second, he is distinguished because he refuses to accept the established institutional arrangements as the impassable horizon of social action. And he believes that this project can be advanced only through cumulative structural change in society. And the acceptance of those ideas leads us in a direction very different from the direction described by Emerson and by Nietzsche. A different understanding of the relation between morals and politics, and therefore a different interpretation of this project of nonconformity and self-invention. And I think that must be a major part of our agenda now in the discussion of the revision of this project. Now, we're not having time to discuss today what we call the paradise of desire. But we should discuss it at least in the first half of class next week. So I just do want to anticipate for your consideration over the ensuing week a thesis about that. So we have in the readings these texts, Barthes describing Fourier and Freud. So there's this idea, maybe there's something else in this contemporary culture, which is this idea that the essential problem is the satisfaction or the frustration of desire, of what Sigmund Freud calls the pleasure principle. And then we have these two versions of it. the saturnine, somber version in Freud's Civilization and its Discontents, and the euphoric version in Fourier as described by Barthes. But the thesis that I want to defend in our conversation is that there is no such escape, because the structure of human desire reenacts all of those problems that we've been discussing. So we desire, and then there's a temporary satiation and boredom, and then we desire more. Our desires go forward. They're empty. They're mimetic. We desire what the others desire. We desire things that are limited, but we really want the unlimited. And so we're bound to this wheel of dissatisfaction and transcendence. And there is no escape through this paradise of desire. It's not something else. It's not a different set of problems. It's the same set of problems that we've been discussing. So that's just my way of anticipating the next step in our conversation.
See you next week.